So welcome to this third session of our webinar series called Social Infrastructure in the Post-COVID City. As usual, I will do a very brief introduction before we get to our guest today. So as you already know, if you took part in the former event, I'm Geoffrey Gullois, a professor of architecture and urbanism at the Faculty of Architecture of Université-Libre-de-Bruxelles. And today we welcome Professor Chiara Tosi from EUAV. And I will be with my colleague Mathieu Berger from UCL, Metrolab as well, Géry Leloutre from ULB, and probably Chiara Cavalieri will join us as well later on for the discussion. So before I introduce more extensively the guest, so a few words about the Metrolab and this seminar. As you already know, I think Metrolab is a transdisciplinary research group working on public policies and urban transformation in Brussels. It is funded by the ERDF, European Regional Development Fund of Brussels, and it investigates three different thematics: urban inclusion, urban ecology, and urban production. This webinar is part of the urban inclusion research and ongoing debate, a research that investigates spaces and environment that have a role in including or excluding people and citizens. Metrolab research on urban inclusion was mainly conducted by my colleague, among other, Mathieu, Benoit, and Louise Carrier in 2017 and 2018, and summarized in the publication Designing Urban Inclusion. But to address the question of space of inclusion in time of pandemic and sanitary crisis, we decided to launch this seminar on social infrastructure in the post-COVID city. The starting point for this seminar is the keyword social infrastructure and the role these social infrastructure can play in time of crisis, especially for fragile population. This was the subject of the first webinar organized on 17 November with Eric Linenberg. Eric analyzed the role played by social infrastructure, such for example as public library or community center, during the 1995 Chicago heat wave or the 2020 COVID pandemic. 1 week later, on 24th November, we had the chance to welcome Marc Pimlott. Marc shared with us his long-term research on public interior. He reminded us how, through history, public interior have been both a tool for capitalist domination, but also social emancipation. The discussion with Marc highlighted the role that large open public interior could play in time of sanitary and social crisis. Today, we welcome Professor Chiara Tosi for this first session of our webinar. Chiara is PhD in urbanism and professor in urban design at EUAV, University of Venice. She's also the scientific coordinator of the PhD program in urbanism in this university. She's, of course, taking part in many research projects on the study of human settlements, water landscape, and food systems. But the specific reason for inviting her in this webinar series is the interest she has unfolded for so-called welfare spaces with Professor Stefano Munarin. Through a series of papers published around 2010, Chiara and Stefano analyzed the welfare spaces that were constructed during 20th and 21st century in Europe as space for collective activity, services, and equipment. Chiara's notion of welfare space is, of course, embedded in the welfare state policies that characterize Europe since World War II. for this webinar series, it will be, of course, interesting to question the relation and difference between social infrastructure developed by Klinenberg in the North American context and the welfare space developed in the context of Europe by Maria Chiara and Stefano. In her lecture, Maria Chiara will address the definition of welfare space and its embodiment in the Veneto context. I think she will also elaborate how welfare space can be a tool for developing new urban planning strategies. Following Maria Chiara's lecture, I will of course invite my colleagues, Mathieu Berger, Géry Leloutre, and Chiara Cavalieri to intervene. I hope this will be an opportunity to question the role of welfare space in relation to the sanitary crisis and the post-COVID city. So Maria Chiara, the floor, or more the screen, is yours.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you so much, and thank you to Metrolab for the very kind invitation to take part in this series of webinar. It's of course an honor for me to be here with you today and for sharing my reflection with all of you. So let me start sharing my presentation. So can you see it? Yeah, okay. Let me move this. Okay. So, well, my lecture today is divided in 3 parts. First of all, I will try to discuss why welfare space is interesting today for interpreting what is going on in our cities. The second part is related to how welfare space has taken place in a specific kind of our cities, what we call città diffusa. And the third part, in the third part, I will try to pose some questions according to my research. So, why welfare space? So let me start quoting Edward Soja, that in 1996 said that in his essay, in one of his essays, The City and Special Justice, posed a question: why special and why now? And trying to give an answer to this question, he argued that whatever your interest may be, they can be significantly advanced by adapting a critical spatial perspective. And he also recognized a significantly change in the thinking about space, from emphasizing flat cartographic notion of space as container or stage of human activity to an active force shaping human life. And also, he also pointed out this special turn as the primary reason for the attention that started being given to the concept of spatial justice and to the broader specialization of the basic ideas of democracy and human rights, as in the revival of Lefebvre's notion of the right to the city. So it's under this special turn that me, together with Stefano Munarin, we started looking at the physical dimension of welfare policies, at what we call welfare space. So going back to 2012, when the presidents of the European Council, the European Commission and the European Parliament received the Nobel Peace Prize. And commenting on this event, Jürgen Habermas pointed out how, along with the merit of having achieved peace after repeated fratricidal wars and of having developed the constitutive strength of democracy, the Swedish committee wanted, with this Nobel Peace Prize, wanted to reward the third great feat of Europe, its social model based on welfare state. So my speech will try to deal with the relationship between welfare policies and the city, the way in which the complex set of actions designed to ensure greater well-being to different populations influence the building of the city, depositing facilities and spaces and infrastructure for the society, and conversely, how the city and its special articulations contribute to the well-being of its inhabitants. Well, recognizing the erosion which the term welfare state has undergone in recent decades, a process of misrepresentation and emptying of meaning that made it almost unpresentable today. We can't say welfare state easily. The assumption is that trying to establish a new connection of meaning, this term could be still a useful operative concept. Useful because capable of illumining the settling phenomena by reflecting mainly on collective well-being rather than on individual well-being. That is already a much studied entity in our individualistic society. And so, by paying attention to public spaces more than to private buildings. So the object of my reflection concerned welfare space that were constructed during the 20s and at the beginning in the 2 decades of the 21st century in Europe as spaces for collective life activities, as a social infrastructure. And this mix and network of spaces, facilities and services provide an image of the city that is completely different from the one that we usually have, as you can see in this picture, that represent this network of facilities, services, and what we call welfare spaces. So, to work on this topic with the broadened perspective of Europe is urgent for three main reasons. The first one is that the widespread presence of public facilities like schools, hospitals, parks, sport fields, and so on, even if not always correctly located or built, in my view, constitute one of the key characteristics of the contemporary European city, as one of its main factors of identity. If from the very past we inherit castles, dome, churches, and so on, from the 20th century and 21st century, we are inheriting welfare spaces. The second reasons why it's important to deal with this issue is because welfare space is one of the areas in which citizens can determine their very identity and form a spirit of citizenship. I usually show this picture that represents a couple of Chinese that decided to celebrate their wedding, the wedding day, taking picture in a public park in the mainland of Venice and not in the old city center of Venice. So probably this space is one of the spaces in which they became Italian citizens. And thirdly, because to investigate a welfare space means to work out the themes of urbanity or mixité through the construction of urban fabrics that are livable, comfortable, healthy, and safe. So, to study welfare space leads to deal with the difficulty of living in many parts of cities and territories constructed after World War II, with the hostility that many parts of the city have in relation to their inhabitants, especially the young, the elderly, or physically impaired, the one that has the most important problems in living in the daily life, in living the city. Since it's not the misery of the urban spaces as well of the landscape, their resistance to the normal unfolding of our daily lives has gradually weakened the right to the city, the right to live in a comfortable, healthy and safe city, establishing an important link between special misery and injustice. But it's not a question of great misery, of a radical material poverty, but, as Pierre Bourdieu said, the misery of positioning, that is the set of difficulties and frustrations one clashes with daily while using the city. So that the injustice of the spaces we live in grows ever greater. But the definition of special injustice, we should remember that comprises several and diverse aspects. When we speak about special injustice, we somehow speak of injustice in mobility, with the prevalence and almost the monopoly of the car, capable of establishing generational gaps as well as economic ones, because we should remember that also even if in Europe, even if we are a rich country, there are several people that are not that do not have the possibility to buy a car. But when we speak of special injustice, we also speak of the pulverization of criticalities with the territorial and social system of family networks that seems to absorb difficulties, inequalities, poverty and crisis, but actually distributes and hides them inside the home. This is probably more common in the Mediterranean countries, where families still play an important role in the process of hiding the problems of the larger networks. But when I speak of special injustice, for instance, I'm having in my mind places like the one you are seeing, a children daycare or a school or a nursery that is too far from home, or the absence of a nearby park. And again, the discontinuity of a sidewalk or a bicycle path. And it's important to remember that all these aspects may be considered just as a short list in which we can begin to specify what makes for laborers living in our cities and our territories. All these things have led me to reflect on the urban and social infrastructure, on what does not create individual wealth directly, but contribute to the collective well-being. So, let me move to the second part, in which I will try to explain a little bit better what I'm thinking when I use also the concept of welfare space. We know that such kind of difficulties, the special injustice that we find in the city and in the territory, have led increasing numbers of people to find individual solutions to the issue, to search for comfort inside their own home or abandon urban space. And the transfer towards suburban areas, toward what we call in Italy and in Veneto region, città diffusa, also leads to the theme of the search for individual comfort. So when I speak of città diffusa, I have such kind of image in my mind. The sprawl of settlements all around the region, with very small villages, very sprawled around the whole territory. Here, perhaps you can recognize Venice, and the Veneto region is the one all around. So Veneto region has been studied by me and Stefano Munarin, starting from the hypothesis that the phenomena of sprawl have concerned not only residential and industrial fabric, but also the production of collective services and equipment of welfare space. And we recognize that over time, so these policies of infrastructure, the investment in social and cultural capital gave rise to a plurality of spatial organization. So here you can see the sprawl also of welfare spaces in the region. And it seems possible to affirm that the distribution of services and facilities in the Veneto region has been driven by a goal. A school, a kindergarten, and a sport field for each bell tower. As you can see here in this example, it is a small municipality in the Veneto region where you can see how the services are sprawled in every little village. So each village has elementary school, nursery, sport facilities, the theater, and so many other things. So welfare spaces are distributed and sprawled as the territory is sprawled. In the case of schools, as you can see here, this is the map that represents how schools at different levels are sprawled all around the region. But also in the case of productive areas. Here you can see the very small industrial areas sprawled all around the region. And what is interesting, what we found in our research is that searching some productive areas, we have seen how a network of facilities and social practices are changing these areas profoundly. The workspaces and the production areas, after a period of intense expansion and after the formation of numerous monofunctional enclaves, in recent years, thanks to their internal and external accessibility and to their ample endowment with car parks, are providing to be flexible fabrics into which an increasing number of services and facilities are being inserted, as you can see also in this picture. So next to the traditional spaces, we begin to see kindergartens, like here, or gyms, or again places for the village festival, or as you can see here, or again places for circus, but also place for collective eating, swimming pools, playing fields, bicycle paths, collective canteens, public parks, playgrounds, and so on. So all these places are not just becoming something else from the industrial areas. But we think that, we believe that the presence of this welfare space inside also the industrial areas are posing new questions relating precisely to the issue that we are addressing. But again, we also notice that natural spaces are becoming space for social interaction. We can say that a recent rediscovery by the local population of environmental heritage, recovered through spontaneous and informal practices that give a social meaning to marginal spaces or to protected area. So we are facing collective spaces often created thanks to a simple change in the legal status of places, which are already natural, like rivers or disused quarries, marginal mountain areas, and others, rather than by their being planned from scratch. And often the quality of these spaces lies precisely in their vaguenesses. a person goes to one of these spaces rather than to a design park, precisely because the former allow more freedom and diversified uses. So using the idea of freedom proposed by Isaiah Berlin, we could interpret these spaces as free from object and furniture, and within which we can feel free to be, free to interpret the space. And we recognize not only the emergence of new requests for collective space in the natural space, but also the pursuit of what constitutes a common good, an identity element around which to define new forms of active citizenship. In fact, it's often from these spaces and their related practices that committees, associations, and groups of citizens interested in defending and enhancing them come to life, becoming managing entities responsible for public spaces. So taken together, these spaces and practices, which are inextricably linked, constitute a sort of new layer of welfare spaces. So like spaces along riverbanks that becomes cycle paths, or disused quarries like this one that become a flood retention basins and a fetal remediation area at the same time, but also a public park. Or again, agrarian roads that are used for several activities. So all these collective activities took advantage of existing natural spaces, making them accessible through pedestrian and cycle paths. And these new facilities find their foundation in a new cultural attitude that interprets the territory at the same time as an ecological good, a natural capital, and a collective place, a space that keep together ecological and environmental functions with the collective uses. An urban and social infrastructure produced by the public, but which are nourished by the collectivity. They are top-down products, but at the same time nourished by bottom-up processes. So it is while observing these spaces that we started thinking that it's also from here that we can start a conscious public policy, interested in reducing form of economic, social, and spatial injustice. And we asked ourselves how welfare spaces built during more than half a century may be considered today as the starting point for a Greek transformation of a region like the Veneto. So, starting from this reflection on how welfare spaces, the presence of these different layers of welfare spaces in the Veneto region, we started imagining how to transform them, how to start from them for rethinking a more just territory. So the proposed transformation through the scenario Veneto Welfare Space 2030, equipped and accessible, is really a simple and apparently banal idea that each inhabitant in the Veneto region should be able to reach on foot, by bicycle, or using public transports in a reasonable time, 15-20 minutes. Primary and secondary schools, playgrounds, parks, health centers, elderly centers, sporting areas, and all welfare spaces. And that this may be done safely and in comfortable conditions. So all the gray area that you see represented in this map are the part of territory that people can join using pedestrian and cycle paths and public transport in less than 15-20 minutes. It's quite clear that the issue to consider involves not so much the increase in facilities, because as I already said, what we inherit in Europe from the last 50, 60, 70 years is an important network of equipments, of facilities. So it's not the issue is not to increase in facilities as their accessibility. So the accessibility of this network is one of the most important aspects. And accessibility has been considered as an instrument through which to ensure the right to have rights to education, health, leisure, and so on. So accessibility as an instrument for reducing the barriers this work of reducing barrier to access means first working on the visibility, the permeability and safety condition of the services and facilities. And it's within this reflection that I quickly want to present an exploration on a specific facility and equipment, the school. In this neighborhood, the large presence of schools located near the main route, the schools are the red building represented in this map, are all located, as you can see, near the main route that passes through. And we have tried to redesign this, the street and also the school while trying to achieve various goals. The first one is to make the pedestrian and bicycle access to the schools easier and safer. And this has led, for example, to changing the school entrance, which is often oriented toward the driveway and parking lot. And we try to reverse it and to move it on the side of pedestrian and bicycle path. And building new small, very small areas, very small buildings for the reception desk, also useful for connecting the school buildings, among them the school and the gym, or the kindergarten and the elementary school, in order to protect children from bad weather during their daily transfer, but also, and for the same reasons, we decided to build several shelters that were used to connect the entrance gate to the courtyard of the school, where the bicycle shelters and parents' waiting space were also placed, with the entrance to the building. So the second objective of this example of this exploration on school is to strengthen this main route of the city as a collective space, holding together and giving special coherence to the set of paths to access the schools and other collective facilities, the public transit stops and the pedestrian and bicycle path. So this was an attempt to verify how to consider the network of welfare spaces as a starting point for a new vision for the territory. Well, going to the third part of my speech, I want to present now, after having described how welfare space is organized in a specific part of the territory in the Città Diffusa, I would like to present some reflection that come out from the research on welfare space. I know, together with Stefano Munarin, we know quite well that doing this research, we were reworking an old discussion and maybe only renewing claims on the Lefebvre right to the city. But I feel that today this has become necessary. On the one hand, to investigate the relationship between welfare policies and the city, intended as a structure of impersonal relations, is an issue of great social relevance that cannot sufficiently or easily be exhausted. And on the other hand, if it's true that the worst illness that afflicts welfare today is its loss of legitimacy, due to the legitimization of its visionary core, as Tony Judt remember us, it may be of use also in the field of urban design to investigate and explore what tools and which projects we can imagine in order to improve the logistic essentiality and the sustainable speciality of our cities, the urban and social infrastructures that enable to reduce disparity and not differences, while helping in governing conflict and contributing to the positive development of civil life. Well, when we began this reflection in 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it seems the time had expired. Welfare is over, and it makes no sense to do research on something that no longer exists, said several friends and colleagues with a smile on their faces at that time. It's true that for a long time we have seen a continual reduction of welfare policies, and that we are in a state socialism for the rich and neoliberalism for the poor, as Ulrich Beck usually said. But precisely in the face of this apparent outmodedness, these contradictory signals, and the relevance and oblivion of welfare policies, and of course the spaces produced by them, it seemed to us, to me, useful to work on these themes and to start my research for three different reasons. To investigate the strategies of collective well-being carried out by people in daily practices, the many forms of peaceful coexistence that find in public space and in welfare spaces a fundamental support, observing the practices of sociality that take place here, going beyond the exaltation of super places or self-segregation strategies that abound in much recent literature. The second reason is to review the close relationship that modern urban planning has maintained with the policies of the welfare state, as Secchi remember in his book of 2005. And today, when urban planning, on the one hand, is being questioned by the myth of the inviolability of the free market, while on the other is being loaded with new expectations related to process of social rearticulation and the risks of globalization and environmental issues. And the third one is to come out of a reductively monetary vision of welfare, returning to a more complex vision of the policies to which it can refer, with, of course, all their symbolic and political ideological weight, and reaffirm a broader view as an instrument for cohesion and for social sharing. And it's within this context that welfare, not necessarily state-based, and of course welfare spaces, are operational concepts, open concepts, which are not interested in delineating and enclose it right away in a narrow definition, but which, on the contrary, are interesting to us precisely because of their ambiguity, for the very fact of their being both an instrument and the object of the research. So, recalling also that welfare spaces as a socio-urban infrastructure is important to help the last, but also to involve the first. They are an instrument of social cohesion in order to bring everyone to participate in the same spaces and with the same equipment, building citizenship. As an example, we can think that public school must be of good quality, not only to give the opportunity to study to those who cannot afford anything else, but also to avoid those who can afford something more from isolating themselves in private schools. So welfare spaces should be should be imagined as an instrument of cohesion from which pragmatically to rebuild a citizens' pact between the social strata, classes and populations, based not only and not mainly on the intermittent sharing of some general principles, as much as on daily coexistence. It should be a pact created through the sharing of spaces and practices. We are together, constituting a people, because every day we take the same bus, we bring our children to the same school, we bump into each other in the waiting room at the doctor office, and we recognize each other at the park. A pact that does not need to be defined a priori and on the basis of exclusions and differences, us and them, but which is built and strengthened almost implicitly, day after day, with the need for common, shareable spaces and practices. If the term welfare state today may appear worn out to the point of being almost unusable, as already said, to me it continues to seem rich in meaning and also evocative, if nothing else, when recalling that it became current in the 40s, when the Archbishop of York began to use it to emphasize the contrast between welfare state, to one hand, as a social contract on which democracy in Great Britain was based, and warfare state, as a social contract on which the Nazi dictatorship in Germany was based. A social contract, however, imperfect and always precarious, in which the state undertakes to ensure the well-being of its citizens, rather than a social contract based on the power and fear of a state of war. So once again, the focus is on cities, on the network of welfare space as instrument of coexistence, places that by forcing people to share their life experiences with others, allows them to learn how to live together. Keeping in mind that welfare spaces as well as urban environments are places for the practice of democracy, places where what brings people together is a goal, an end, an idea of the future, rather than something that we inherit from the past. So it's thanks to the exploration on the Città Diffusa and on many other parts of the European territory that we recognize how different requests, a complex set of questions about the quality of living, are today closely linked to the daily, ordinary dimension of practices, urging urban planning to adjust its form of intervention by pursuing a concrete idea of a just city rather than a refounding of its disciplinary code. So, said differently, urban planning and the project regarding urban space today, for me, should focus more intensely on that set of characteristics of cities that can guarantee social equity, greater collective well-being, paying attention to the bodily dimension of spaces, to the concrete possibilities for persons to lead a life characterized by health, safety, and comfort. And it is in this sense that, in my opinion, the new possible welfare policies are giving rise to new types of requests for urban planning. It is in this sense that welfare policies interrogate urban planning, posing several questions. We can say that today many portions of the city and territory show a significant distance between the urban project of equipment and the social policies aimed at ensuring services. A distance made evident by the difficulty in organizing the spaces, but also by the non-convergence of goals between the players involved, by a very important lack of collaboration between different areas of responsibility, and mostly, it happened mostly in the local administrations. If it's true that the city and the territory, when properly treated, have proven capable of improving everyday life by ensuring greater well-being, safety, health, and justice, it is not clear that the active involvement of citizens in the redevelopment projects is useful to strengthen the active adoption of services and equipment, thus alleviating the insecurity of places and also improving livability. So speaking of urban welfare, therefore, it appears that the planners is called once again to go through the arena of a re-articulated public space, trying to enkindle virtuous synergy between planning, citizen participation, and social policies. An integration that seems to be practiced little, very little, we can say, favoring instead form of sectorialization and fragmentation, above all of the results and the relative material deposits left in the territory. So this is why all this reflection led me to think that we need to go beyond the project of equipment. What is needed is the project of the excipient. As already said, the European city and territory have in recent decades been the subject of an equipping of urban and social policies, and they have seen a significantly production of welfare spaces. But what have these processes left on the ground concretely, and how is it possible today to start anew from this deposit to increase the livability of cities and territory? And can a different directed attention to welfare spaces help in the renovation of the city and territory? So, taking a look at what is being done in our cities, we often note banal sectorial and not integrated solutions centered on specific issues like mobility in the city rather than livability of the city or environment in the city and so on. And it's only in very few occasions that we recognize projects or policies that work on the relationship between welfare spaces and the settlements that have grown up around them. And this operation, even if small, both in size and number, seek to turn locked spaces into collective infrastructure. Try to rethink the in-between spaces. Try to work around the concept of urban excipients, going toward a greater permeability of the city. And they encourage me to continue my reflection on the elements of urban cohesion, on the city as an instrument of coexistence, as I also said before, and more generally on the elements that allow discourse about just city. And when we practice the consolidated city, the old one in particular, think at Venice, the old city center of Venice, We tend to use and recognize above all the quality of the in-between space, between the exterior and the interior, between the individual and the collective space, recognizing how this in-between space is both rich and articulate. Rich of different devices like porch, church steps, hall, foyer, square, gallery, a plethora of different devices that enrich the in-between space. Several recent and sufficiently widespread projects have drawn our attention to these in-between spaces, also in contemporary cities. And so through minimal intervention at the boundaries of architecture, accepting and working on the faults and cracks of the city, proposing these works as incremental and basically low cost, open to evolution over time, these projects tend to develop the urban walkability. And in this way, they try to improve also the livability of the city. So it's reflecting on welfare space that we start to research on what holds together the individual facilities or equipment, what makes a city an agglomeration of buildings, and what lies between one comfortable welfare space and another. And often the individual places and building of welfare, what we call equipments, are well made. There are schools that works very well, and the same for the libraries, and the same for swimming pools or gyms or whatever you want. But what is missing, what is really missing or look shabby and not very inviting, reduced to its technical function, is what stands between things, among the buildings. So roads, parking lots, sidewalk and bike path, and so on. So let me try a parallelism between a medicine and an urban project. Reading the list of ingredients in an ordinary pill for headache, for instance, one finds a single active ingredient, such as ibuprofen, alongside with a surprising list of excipients: ethicellulose, acetophthalate cellulose, maize starch, microcrystalline cellulose, saccharin, and so many other excipients. So sometimes we think that with the same imagination, by concocting new materials in the city, we should think a bit more about excipients, about the materials that bind things together, which hold things together, making possible not only the use of such things, but their very existence. And in many parts of the contemporary city, even the well-equipped, the one that has a lot of equipments, if it is as if the excipient were missing among the active ingredients, a cohesive element holding together the parts, functions and practices. And this fact highlights the need to resume planning reflection on the in-between spaces and mediating elements between the building, the ground and the open space around it. So this is my last slide, so I'm going quickly to the conclusion. As I've already pointed out, when observing the city and the spaces produced by welfare policies, we believe important to concentrate our attention in particular on the places and activities through which people seek to fulfill not so much individual comfort, but that part of well-being that needs and is stimulated by being together, fostering practices of sharing. Even Anthony Giddens, while reflecting, we can say the father of welfare policy studies, while reflecting on a possible new welfare, at a certain point asserts that the most useful welfare is designed to increase solidarity and to reconciling the diversity of cultures and lifestyles with general social cohesion. Recognizing in this way that the art of living peacefully and happily with differences and taking advantage of this variety of stimuli and opportunities is becoming the most important ability that an individual needs to learn and exercise, as Bauman said. And what we have noticed is that parks, civic center, children recreation centers, and all these facilities and equipments that goes under the umbrella of welfare spaces. These spaces and services produced by the glorious era of the welfare state, beside being functional facilities, without which millions of people's lives would be much more difficult, it's important to remember they are free of charge. These are open access places in which socialization and sharing happen free. They are free places where people meet, deal with each other, and coexist. And these concepts seem interesting because they allow to return to the idea of the city as a support, able to foster and stimulate social relationship. So by rediscovering a long-standing relationship between modern design and collective spaces, as Tom Habermas pointed out 10 years ago, these concepts inspired to research and work on designing public spaces that allow and help the development of socializing practices. So said differently, it has seemed nearly inevitable to reflect on the concept of reciprocity and relationality, because although urban planners are generally dealing with positional good, today it may be useful to observe if and how welfare spaces are presented as infrastructure capable of receiving and stimulating relational practices, social capital of reciprocity, common services, a series of social goods that constitute the true wealth of nations, that wealth that every country should seek and cultivate today. So in conclusion, nothing new, or perhaps simply a different way to bring our attention back to a very old but crucial issue: the city as an instrument of impersonal life, the mode in which the diversity and complexity of persons, interests, and tastes become available as social experience. Well, thank you so much. So let me...
Thank you.
Yeah, I invite Mathieu could turn his camera on. Thanks for this inspiring lecture. So Mathieu is with us, Sarah and Louise as well, and Jerry has joined me here. Chiara, I don't think Chiara Cavalier will join us, but anyway, I might maybe start and give later on the word to my colleagues. Maybe in order to relate to the two former lecture and sessions that we had, were, let's say, relation with the notion of social infrastructure that was developed by Eric Hildenberg, but also of public interior that Mark Pimlott developed. One aspect struck me if I relate your presentation to the one we had before, is indeed what I would call the relational or the network aspect. I mean, in the talk of Eric Klinenberg on social infrastructure, but he often used the word Palace for the People. That's the name of his book, and it says something. Mathieu and Benoit, in their conclusion of designing urban inclusion, use inclusive enclave. So one of the key difference is the way you emphasize the question of relation between social infrastructure, between equipment, between space, what I would call the network aspect of welfare space, instead of being only spaces, I mean, say remote spaces. And I believe, but it would be good to hear Mathieu about that, that one of the aspects that, again, that was put in place by him, but also by Eric Liedenberg, is the fact that it's a safe space, that is, in a way, there is some remote aspects. Again, let's hear Mathieu about that later on. I guess it's also related to, might be related to the tradition of urbanism that very much often favor, I would say, this interrelation aspect. Of course, you use a lot the word excipient, and you say beyond equipment, not to use equipment that is maybe the modern way of seeing public services, public equipment. You also mentioned that many space of socialization can happen in space where it is not expected, like economic spaces, industrial spaces, but also, for example, on space for mobility that have basically a functional aspect, but that can be in a way used in a more socializing aspect. So I would like maybe to hear you about that, and maybe to ask to Mathieu as well what he thinks, maybe after I give you the words, in order to see this tension maybe that we have between building space for socialization, remote or safe space for socialization, and at the same time allowing for a network of these spaces. You want to start, Maria Chiara?
Oh yeah, no, I was waiting for Mathieu, but I can add something. Yes, of course. Thank you for your reflection. Maybe the most important word that I've been using for discussing the relevance of welfare spaces is excipient, and it changes. It's let me say it's very, very close to the idea of the project of the ground of Bernardo Secchi. When in 1998 I was a collaborator of Bernardo Secchi, and we worked together at the plan of Prato and then at the plan of Brescia. And in fact, what we tried to do was to work in the in-between spaces. And the progetto di suolo, the project of the ground, it's the translation is not proper, but the idea was how to keep things together, how to keep also things that has been imagined as spaces for social cohesion. So the effort is really to go beyond, and to imagine that the city is the support, the city is the stage where you can try to rebuild and to stress the importance of the relational practices. What I tried also to stress this evening in my lecture is that we need a very important effort, and it's not only. The problem is that this is an effort that the municipalities, the technical offices that are in charge of projecting and transforming the city should be able to deal with this issue. So how to manage and how to transform the technical spaces, so all the spaces that are in between a school, between a park, between a residential area, how to transform these technical spaces in places for relation among people. So that's my point. I think that the project of the network, the idea that welfare spaces are not only the main equipments produced, but is a network that incorporate somehow also parking plot, streets, and pedestrian and cycle path, all that stuff that is in the middle. It's well, it's what can improve the capability of the city to be the stage for the coexistence of differences, of different people.
Okay. Am I talking now, Geoffrey? Okay. Thank you, Maria Chiara. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Audience. Okay. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting, and Geoffrey was right to emphasize this network aspect, of course, that you introduced with the spatial approach and the more, let's say, macro territorial approach to this question of the welfare space. So it is true that we heard Eric Kleinenberg talking about his conception of social infrastructure, and as Geoffrey said, we try to develop this idea of inclusive enclaves, and I would like to share it with you.
No, I can't hear you. You have your microphone.
Okay. Oh, sorry. The microphone was just shut for a moment. So I hope you heard me until recently.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, this idea of the inclusive enclave that I wanted to share or to discuss with you, because it talks. Just a moment. So how did we introduce this notion? Some elements of context, maybe. In Brussels, these last 25, 30 years, city policies and urban policies were mostly about producing welfare spaces. Actually, it was the and sorry to refer to our own local Brussels context, but it can be a basis for the conversation. And through the neighborhood contract policy, the region of Brussels produced welfare spaces in masses all across throughout the city, throughout the region, in a certain priority geographic zones, but it was scattered all around the region. And through the neighborhood contracts, we produced social facilities, green spaces, new squares, renovated places, streets, and so on. And of course, they did that through a multiplicity of programs with small operations, to take the medicine metaphor that you that you used earlier. worked on welfare spaces and on the welfare quality of the city through a sort of homeopathy or acupuncture, as people say, right? So this was the trend or the culture of urban policies in Brussels until recently. And then, let's say about 7 to 5 years ago, we discovered this sort of post-welfare trends in a certain way, which was a little bit fed up with the small scale, and people were expecting to develop more ambitious projects and visions and to rediscover bigness, right? But this the way we rediscovered bigness was also in an ideological framework where welfare values were not highlighted that much anymore. So instead of policies developing small operations across the territory in scattered areas, but sustaining welfare values, we had policies focusing on bigger, larger operations in central areas, but pursuing pseudo values of creativity and innovation. So this was the context, and we also noticed that when projects pursuing welfare values were enacted in Brussels, they were highlighting or fostering also the big or the bigness of the project and the large social projects, such as the pedestrian boulevards in the central downtown Brussels. The boulevards were transformed into the largest area in Europe. So this sort of macro mega public spaces or social infrastructure was the new big thing, of course. And I mean, everybody was on the same page for that. And culturally, you could see that both the governmental strategies and the culture in the urban professionals milieu were attuning to these ideas. It was also the case, I guess, for the young architects in schools who were, of course, maybe more excited to do big things, and these young people who started a little bit to find that the small operations were a little bit cheesy for has-been urbanists, right? So I guess that's now the challenge is to find ways to rediscover smallness, so to speak, and in this context or vision of the città diffusa, if I say it right. And this was also a little bit our idea with Benoit and other people to give a sort of a counter argument to the people developing very large and mega projects regarding central areas, supposed to work as strong antibiotics to stay in the medicine metaphor. And we proposed a vision where welfare spaces and social infrastructure in neighborhoods that are not central and that do not have the same urban quality, you will find them mostly in indoor qualitative spaces, right? Or spaces that have a certain form of inclusion or enclosure. Maybe they're not totally closed, but they're closed enough to protect the inside from a non-favorable urban surrounding, which is, the one you find in places characterized by misery, as you said earlier. Huh? So you will find small palaces for the people, let's say, or small gems in these neighborhoods that are on the overall in poor conditions and blighted. Yes, there is this program or this idea of an archipelago, so to speak, an archipelago of welfare islands or social islands that can offer quality spaces in the context of blighted areas in poor urban conditions. And I guess this is a needed complement to what's developed right now in central areas and that focuses on the big. Okay, and so how this idea of an archipelago of inclusive enclaves, as we call them, does resonate in your own work, and does that make sense at all? And I guess starting from these maps and the networks that you the sort of fabric of welfare spaces that you produced or on your maps can have some meaning in your own work. Sorry, I've been very long, but
No.
It took a while to contextualize a little bit.
Yeah, I think that what has happened during the last 6-7 months COVID pandemic can help us a little bit to better understand also the issue that you are raising, the idea of having of the city as an archipelago of welfare islands. I mean, what several urban policies are stressing is the need to go back to neighborhood, to go back to the 15 minutes radius from home, to reproduce enclaves in the city, providing inside this 15 minutes walking radius neighborhood all the stuff that you need for your life. I mean, shops, facilities, services, and everything. If from one hand we can say that it's important that at the urban scale, I mean, the administration, the techniques and so on have rediscovered the importance of the small scale. So perhaps COVID has helped us in rediscovering how the city works at the small scale. But at the same time, I'm a little bit scared, because this idea of 15 minutes walk, it's perhaps it can push the city toward the fragmentation among different communities. And I think it's not something that can help the city at all to overcome the situation of the poverty, the special injustice. So I think that we are in the middle of a process of, to one hand, the rediscovery of the small scale and the neighborhood scale, and the importance of this scale for the emancipation of the city, and to the other, the fact that this kind of policies can to close again the city into fragments, and that in 10 and 20 years we will back again to speak about how to keep together all these different fragments. So that's what I'm thinking. That when I speak of excipients, when I speak of the project of the ground, when I'm thinking at welfare spaces as a relational space, it's for stressing the importance to not close the city in enclaves, even if they are inclusive, because it's a way to reduce the possibility of differences among different culture, different economic position, different religion, different level of scholarization, different whatever you want. It's a way to reproduce fragmentation, segmentarization inside the city. So I think that our task as urban designer, urban planners, is to stress again the importance of the relations, because otherwise all the things that are left among the different enclaves again will be governed as technical spaces. And I don't think that the city need this kind of approach. I don't know if I correctly understood what you were saying, but
may I just I don't know if Jerry wants to talk. I just one word in reaction to what you said, because of course there is something. And I don't want to be to take too much time on this idea of the inclusive enclave, but it's true that it has a provocative dimension,
yes.
of course, because what we wanted to stress with this notion is the fact that a space that can be physically closed or semi-closed can be internally diverse and vibrant and heterogeneous, and that sometimes in certain areas of the city it is under certain conditions and under a certain form of simplification of the form that what's inside will work for what regards the social mix and the encounter between very different people. So, for instance, if you take the example of the abattoir d'Anderlecht in Brussels, maybe you know this place, and this not only a slaughterhouse but a public market. Well, it is maybe the most public and diversified place in Brussels, but it's physically enclaved, and it will be very difficult to work on the space, on the surrounding space, in order to make it qualitative enough to gather, very different people of the city to have to coexist or have common activities together. But you can draw the people inside, and of course you can also work on the lines and on the connectivity between these palaces, so to speak, and other palaces. This is the metaphor maybe of the archipelago or the network of these places that we have to find. But it is true that it will be difficult in very blighted areas that do not have environmental qualities, that are overloaded with car traffic, that remain very gray and sad on the outside, on the street level, to equip these neighborhoods with indoor or semi-closed spaces that can develop an internal quality that is in some way disconnected with the lack of quality characterizing the surrounding. So I totally understand how it can be a little bit maybe the term in itself of the enclave, it is pejorative, or it is understood only for its negative aspect. But I'm totally on the same page with you on the necessity to find ways to keep the city together and not to accelerate the fragmentation with small projects all around the city. But I think that even small qualitative projects that have this quality also of interiority or closeness can be magnets, so to speak, for people coming from other parts of the city. Maybe Jerry can talk about that, about some of his projects, because in a certain neighborhood that Jerry knows very well, the Masui neighborhood, which is the northern part of the northern quarter of Brussels. Very difficult to say. Well, you have this neighborhood, Masui, which is not very pleasant on the outside, and there you will find two very qualitative places that are very vibrant and that draw an heterogeneous and very mixed public, which is a large sport and culture facility, Pôle Nord. And you can easily miss it from the outside because you don't see it, but it's very large in the inside and very qualitative. And then there is the project that Jerry and his office generated or created a while ago, the small, it's not small, but discrete Parc de la Seine, which is this sort of hidden linear park on the inside of an urban block. And I mean, this kind of places are qualitative both on a micro local level, but they can also be places where people go from other parts of the city for their specific qualities and for and I'm thinking that maybe these places, even though they're not very ambitious or because maybe they're not megalomaniac, can also be places where people get together for this welfare experience that you emphasize.
Yeah, I understand what you are saying, and I can also agree with you. I'm not totally in opposition with what you were describing, but I think that we have a very important responsibility to stress again, and mostly during these times, the importance of designing what stay in the middle of these things, between also these enclaves, because I know also in Italy we have several of this interesting and vibrant and also with the social innovation aspect enclaves. But the point is to make them accessible, to make them accessible for everybody. And when I say everybody, I mean the very young, the kids that don't need to be brought in this place, but their parents and the elderly and the impaired and everything that want to access this space. And maybe in Brussels is different, but in Italian cities, frequently the accessibility of all these spaces are not so easy, and that's what make a space, let me say, unjust, even if it's a vibrant, very nice place.
Right.
We have some example, because I think that the very important point that welfare policies remember us is that welfare in the most part, in the majority of the countries in Europe, was under the universalism principle. And when I say universalism, I mean for everybody, something that is offered to everybody. And what I can see, for instance, we have some interesting example in Italy. In Naples, we have this Asilo Filangieri, which is an old building, an old monastery in the old city center of Naples that have been totally restored and completely renewed from the bottom, now with the participatory process. And it's a very vibrant space, a social innovation spot, but it's not accessible for everybody, because the one that not have the cultural skill to assess in this place is not. So I think that we should keep in our mind at this point that the city that where we live in was built with those ideology in mind, the universalism ideology.
Right, totally agree.
This
is why I took, for example, the most open and inclusive working class market in Brussels, and not a social hub of innovation for creative people, you know. Yeah. Maybe Jerry wanted to react.
On several things, actually. Firstly, your debate about Enclave and the Progetto del Suolo are maybe two things quite different from their origin. I think the Enclave is more a reaction about the need of creating spaces that will also protect people that the society is making as renegades. Our neoliberal society is making a lot of people renegades because they don't have the good papers, they don't have the good diploma and so on. And then yes, there are some places now in the nowadays city, at least in Brussels, and for sure in the US, and it's not a random that this idea of enclosure is also born in this part of the world, in the liberal countries. But that is the question to protect people from a society that is not, by definition, inclusive. And then there were even the Marché des Abattoirs is a place that, to some extent, protects a kind of economy that is not totally official, that is not totally that is not able to be, for example, on the other places like Place Flagey or Place du Châtelain, but or on the new piétonnier, the new how do you say that in English? Pedestrian car-free zone, pedestrian area of the city center. While the Progetto del Suolo it's born as a kind of reaction to the incapacity of the modern time, maybe not the modern urbanism, I don't know, but the modern time, the modern period, to produce an integrated space. The modern implementation, the implementation of the modern, let's say, utopia was a very sectorial implementation. Water was distributed by the water adduction companies, the public transport was done by the public transport companies, social housing was built by the social housing companies, and so on and so on. And then the modern city, let's say Città Diffusa Veneziana, for example, but also our naval stat around Brussels in Brabant is not it's not something else than an agglomeration. I mean, a juxtaposition of dwellings and then a huge set of public facilities. Yes, there are a lot, but they are not connected. Then the Progetto del Suolo was this idea to readjust, to correct this absence of relationship between facilities, and to reinvent a kind of public space for this city that was not designed as a kind of public city. And then there is not, for me, there are two kinds of debates. You are discussing about the kind of two kinds of problematics, and that was my interpretation. I'd like to maybe to also go back to the pact, the idea of the pact you pointed out, Chiara, and in some extent also Mathieu. It's not a random that the contrat quartier, the neighborhood contracts in Brussels, are called contrat de quartier and not plan de quartier, or I don't know what. They are pacts. They are pact between an authority and a society, a pact to get to get a kind of social peace in a city that was not on this time that was a bit segregated as well, with a lot of tensions. And Mathieu wrote a lot about that in a very interesting way, and also in his last book. But this idea of pact is very important because it's always a kind of we need the projet de suolo is not the only. It's not enough. We need it needs to be recognized by the population, to be adopted by the population. Otherwise, it remains a kind of very nice landscape project, and that is maybe the major critique I can express about a lot of landscape projects, of landscape architects, that they just limit their own design to the reliance of the space, the continuity of the space, but that's all. While I think, yes, the welfare space, such you presented it, Chiara, is really a question of yes, a social pact, or at least a kind of collective acceptance that we have a collective space and that we have to use it, which is not that obvious. For sure, in Belgium, I don't know really in Italy, but in Belgium we have the choice of the schools, the choice of the social networks. We have to choose also the hospital. We have to choose. Then we have to choose, and then there's the location of the infrastructure is not the only logic behind the use of it. It's also a question of social choice for specific places, and let's say the more rich people will go to some kind of schools and to some kind of hospital, and other kind of people will go to another. And then the idea of pact, and that is maybe the best thing of the contrat quartier, is then that we have to sometimes also to force or to insist on this necessity of doing something together on a collective space. That was a bit the idea in Mazui, but I won't speak about this project maybe today because it's not the moment. But that is the idea to define together new collective spaces in places where they are not present, and how we can do that, also getting along with some new social infrastructures like schools and but okay, that is a small remark, it's not a question actually. Sorry, therefore.
Maybe Maria Chiara want to react on this. Oops, the matter. Your microphone, yeah.
Sorry. The last picture that I shown during my presentation was taken in a neighborhood contract in Mestre, and it's one of the most interesting to me progetto di suolo that have been done in the last 10 years. And of course, it was the effort to keep together existing building facilities and a park. But what was missing in the previous character of the city was this excipient, something that able to bring together all the different stuff. So I totally agree that and what was important in that case is that the population recognized the importance to change the character of the spaces from parking lots into a collective ground. and they asked to close the street in order to make it a collective ground. So I agree that neighborhood contract and when people has the possibility to discuss and to participate in the production of the design of their neighborhood, it can be an interesting process. So I agree with Géry on this point. But I also want to go back a little bit on the relationship between welfare space and Progetto di Suolo, because if it's true that Progetto di Suolo has that the meaning that was conceived as an attempt to overcome the fragmentation of the city and to work on the in-between spaces between the different parts of the city. But it was also, and we can see, for instance, in the project for Antwerp, or also in the project for the Grand Paris. The Progetto di Suolo was, how to say, it was also the attempt to to reconnect not only parts, not only fragments, but also the heterogeneity of buildings inside the city. There is this passage that is really important. So at the end of the last century, I mean, in the general analysis of the city, we recognize this shift between a city made of fragments into a city made of elements. And that's why the Progetto di Suolo became important. And I think that when I speak about the necessity to keep together of the different equipments, I'm referring to the same issue. So the necessity of make stronger the relationship between the elements in the city, also if they are social equipment.
Thanks a lot for your answer, Chiara. I would like to address some other issue, like new coalition between private actors and let's say grassroots movement, skipping, I would say, public, let's say, welfare spaces, but I think it's already quite late, so I suggest we close the public event here. There was a question from the public, I don't know if you can see it, Maria Chiara, from Peter Benuska. It was already addressed few hour ago, but maybe it's good if you can see it. So he was asking, what about the visual quality of newly established welfare spaces in the industrial area of the Veneto region? I think you mentioned in a way this kind of space. Maybe it's about the new development around other renovation of Veneto region.
Yeah, I can say on this that in many industrial areas we discovered the presence of this widespread presence of social activities, and the shift from a monofunctional area into something that are more, let me say, closer to be part of the city. And so discovering that works is not only, how to say, separated from other function into the city, because, you know, the industrial area I'm referring to are quite young. They were built in the 80s, in the 90s, so it's not so much time, that they started as monofunctional area. And in very few years, like 5, 10 years, they started hosting totally different activities. And this is quite interesting, because the relationship between industrial areas and the small villages in the Città Diffusa started to be stronger. So the festival of the village is still not in the center of the village, close to the church or in the square, the main square, but it's in the industrial area. So the relationship between the two are growing stronger and stronger. So it's an interesting process that need to be considered and designed also.
Thank you, Maria Clara, for this precision. Okay, I suggest to close here again. We could have continued discussing what's passionate thing for an hour, but I think the audience will leave. So, and it was already quite a long, almost 2-hour session. Maybe just before closing, reminding that the webinar is going on. On 5 January, we will have Céline Bonico Donato, I hope I pronounced well her name, a philosopher from École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture de Grenoble, that will talk about crise sanitaire, crise des lieux publics. So this time we'll give the voice to a philosopher, and we will continue later on the event. So I hope we keep the discussion, and also the plan is to have a publication following all the interventions. So really in order to gather the reflection around this notion of social infrastructure, public interior, welfare space, and so on. So thanks again, Maria Chiara, and hope to see all our audience for the coming year in January. Bye.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey.